Franklin Edward Boone adjusted his worn leather gloves as the first grey clouds gathered above the rolling hills west of Fort Collins. The 73-year-old rancher had seen this particular formation before, decades earlier, when the sky held the same metallic sheen and the wind carried that distinct bite that spoke of something more serious than an ordinary Colorado winter storm. The younger hands at the neighboring spreads would glance at their weather apps and modern forecasting equipment, dismissing the old man's concerns with polite nods and barely concealed eye rolls. The retirement home in town had been calling again, leaving messages with Mrs. Henderson at the general store about available beds and assisted living programs. Franklin's own nephew, David, had driven out from Denver the previous month with pamphlets and genuine concern etched across his face, speaking softly about responsibility and practical considerations. The ranch had been losing money for 3 consecutive years, and the bank officials in their pressed suits had begun using words like restructuring and foreclosure with increasing frequency during their visits. Franklin's weathered hands showed every one of his 7 decades working cattle in northern Colorado. His back protested each morning as he pulled on his boots, and his hearing had dimmed enough that he sometimes missed the subtle sounds that once alerted him to trouble in the herd. The arthritis in his knuckles made certain tasks more difficult, and he moved with the deliberate care of a man whose body had absorbed countless impacts from horses, weather, and the general brutality of ranch work. The local ranchers had modernized their operations with GPS tracking for livestock, computerized feeding systems, and satellite weather monitoring. They spoke of Franklin with the fond condescension reserved for relics of a bygone era, sharing stories of his outdated methods at coffee gatherings in town. His insistence on reading natural signs rather than digital forecasts had become something of a local curiosity, a charming anachronism that younger farmers tolerated with good-natured patience. Franklin's knowledge came from sources these modern ranchers had never encountered. During the winter of 1952, he had served as a young Army corporal in a specialized mountain rescue unit stationed at Camp Carson. The unit's mission involved locating and extracting personnel stranded during severe weather events in the Colorado Rockies. Their commanding officer, Captain William Morrison, had trained under men who learned their survival techniques during the harsh winters of the Second World War's European theater. The technique that Franklin remembered most clearly involved creating what Captain Morrison called a thermal retention shelter, a method developed by mountain troops who faced extended exposure during winter reconnaissance missions. The procedure required identifying specific topographical features and utilizing natural wind patterns to create a microclimate that could sustain human life during extended blizzard conditions. The technique appeared deceptively simple to casual observers, leading many to dismiss it as folk wisdom rather than battlefield-tested survival methodology. Captain Morrison had emphasized that the technique's effectiveness depended entirely on precise implementation during the critical window before a storm's most severe phase. Timing and location selection required reading multiple environmental indicators simultaneously, a skill that demanded years of experience and an understanding of how mountain weather systems developed and moved across the terrain. The technique had saved Morrison's unit on multiple occasions during training exercises that unexpectedly encountered actual survival conditions. Franklin had attempted to share this knowledge with the local ranching community during several severe weather events over the past 2 decades. Each time, well-meaning neighbors had insisted on modern approaches, utilizing heated buildings, mechanical generators, and electronic communication systems. Their dismissal of his suggestions never carried malice, but their polite skepticism had gradually discouraged him from offering advice that consistently went unheeded. The atmospheric pressure continued dropping throughout the morning as Franklin moved through his daily routine of checking cattle and maintaining equipment. His 57 head of Angus had clustered near the windbreak he had constructed along the property's northern border, their behavior indicating they sensed the approaching weather system's severity. The horses in the near pasture showed similar restlessness, pawing the frozen ground and periodically lifting their heads to test the air. Franklin's weather instruments consisted of a barometer inherited from his father and his own observations of cloud formations, wind direction changes, and animal behavior patterns. The barometer reading had dropped 7 points since dawn, and the wind had shifted from its typical northwestern pattern to a more ominous southwestern flow. The combination suggested a weather system with significantly more power than the local meteorologists had predicted in their morning broadcasts. The first snowflakes began falling shortly after noon, fat and wet, the kind that indicated substantial moisture content in the advancing storm. Franklin recognized the formation as the leading edge of what Captain Morrison would have classified as a Class 4 weather event, potentially lasting multiple days with sustained wind speeds exceeding 40 miles per hour and accumulation rates that could trap unprepared individuals in dangerously exposed positions. Franklin's nearest neighbors, the Peterson family, operated a modern cattle operation 3 miles east of his property. Their ranch featured heated barns, backup power systems, and computerized monitoring equipment that tracked everything from temperature variations to individual animal locations through electronic tags. Tom Peterson, a man in his 40s with an agricultural engineering degree, represented the new generation of scientific ranching that had largely replaced the intuitive methods Franklin had learned from his father and military service. The Peterson Ranch employed 6 full-time workers during winter months, all equipped with radio communication, GPS devices, and access to real-time weather updates through satellite connections. Their emergency procedures involved moving livestock to heated facilities and maintaining communication with county emergency services through multiple technological backup systems. The operation's efficiency and modern approach had earned recognition from agricultural organizations and had been featured in farming magazines as an example of progressive ranch management. By mid-afternoon, the snowfall had intensified to the point where visibility dropped below 200 yards. Franklin's thermometer registered 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind had begun producing that particular whistle through the bare cottonwood trees that indicated sustained gusts approaching 30 miles per hour. The storm's progression matched the pattern Captain Morrison had taught him to recognize, suggesting conditions would deteriorate rapidly over the next 6 hours before reaching peak intensity. Franklin began implementing the preparation phase of the thermal retention shelter technique. The procedure required identifying a location where natural topography would create a wind shadow during the storm's most severe phase. His property included a natural depression near the southern boundary where a seasonal creek had carved a shallow ravine between 2 low hills. The site's orientation and surrounding terrain would provide protection from the prevailing wind patterns while maintaining access to necessary resources. The shelter construction phase involved creating a specific configuration of barriers using available materials in a pattern that would channel wind flow to create a zone of relative stability. Franklin had stockpiled deadfall branches and sections of snow fencing in strategic locations around the property during the previous autumn, anticipating the eventual need for emergency shelter construction. The technique required building the shelter components in a precise sequence that would remain stable under extreme wind conditions. Franklin worked steadily through the afternoon, his movements economical and purposeful despite the increasing wind and snow. His hands, though stiff with arthritis, retained the muscle memory for tasks he had practiced countless times during those mountain training exercises 32 years earlier. Each element of the shelter's construction served multiple functions, creating overlapping systems that would continue operating even if individual components failed during the storm's peak intensity. The temperature continued dropping as afternoon faded toward evening, reaching 12 degrees Fahrenheit by 4 o'clock. The wind had increased to consistent gusts of 35 miles per hour, and the snowfall had evolved into the fine, driving pellets that indicated the storm's transition into its mature phase. Weather radio broadcasts began issuing increasingly serious warnings about blizzard conditions and travel restrictions, though the official forecasts still underestimated the storm's ultimate severity. Franklin's cattle had moved into the windbreak area and were beginning to cluster in the specific formation that indicated their instinctive response to extreme weather. His years of experience had taught him to recognize when livestock sensed conditions that exceeded their natural tolerance levels. The animal's behavior suggested this storm would push beyond the limits of conventional shelter arrangements, potentially creating life-threatening situations for both animals and humans caught without adequate protection. The Peterson Ranch's modern facilities were designed to handle typical Colorado winter weather, but Franklin's assessment of the developing conditions suggested this storm would test systems in ways the engineering specifications had not anticipated. The temperature differential between heated buildings and outside air would create significant stress on mechanical systems, while sustained high winds could disrupt power supplies and communication networks that the ranch's emergency procedures assumed would remain operational. As darkness approached, Franklin completed the final phase of his shelter preparation. The thermal retention configuration was invisible to casual observation, appearing to be merely a random arrangement of branches and fencing materials. The technique's effectiveness lay in its interaction with wind patterns and topographical features, rather than in any obviously impressive construction. Captain Morrison had emphasized that the method's subtlety was often the reason civilians failed to understand its importance until they witnessed its performance during actual emergency conditions. Franklin's radio picked up emergency broadcasts reporting increasingly severe conditions throughout northern Colorado. Highway patrol units were responding to multiple vehicle accidents caused by rapidly deteriorating visibility, and several mountain communities had lost electrical power due to wind damage. The storm's progression was exceeding all official predictions, developing into the kind of weather event that occurred perhaps once in a decade. The wind reached sustained speeds of 40 miles per hour shortly after 6 o'clock, with gusts approaching 55. The temperature had dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit, creating a wind chill factor that made exposed skin dangerous after minutes rather than hours. Franklin's shelter site remained relatively protected due to the topographical features he had selected, but even within the wind shadow, conditions were becoming genuinely hazardous for anyone without proper preparation. Franklin's emergency supplies included sufficient food and water for 3 days, plus additional materials for maintaining body heat and protecting against frostbite. His preparation reflected the military training that had taught him to assume worst-case scenarios rather than hoping for favorable outcomes. The thermal retention technique included specific provisions for extended survival periods, acknowledging that rescue or relief might not be possible until weather conditions improved sufficiently to allow safe movement. Emergency radio traffic increased dramatically as the storm intensified throughout the evening hours. County rescue teams reported being unable to respond to calls due to zero visibility and dangerous road conditions. The Peterson Ranch's backup power systems activated around 8 o'clock, when the primary electrical supply failed due to wind damage to transmission lines. Their heated barns continued operating on generator power, but the fuel consumption rate was higher than anticipated due to the extreme temperature differential. Franklin monitored the radio communications while remaining in his shelter, listening to the growing number of emergency situations developing across the region. Search and rescue teams were receiving calls from stranded motorists, isolated residents without heat, and ranch operations experiencing equipment failures. The storm's intensity had overwhelmed the infrastructure that normally provided reliable protection during winter weather events. The thermal retention shelter's performance became apparent as the night progressed and conditions reached their most severe phase. While exposed areas experienced wind chills approaching -20 degrees Fahrenheit, the shelter's interior maintained a temperature nearly 30 degrees warmer than the surrounding environment. The technique's effectiveness resulted from its ability to capture and retain body heat while preventing wind from disrupting the thermal envelope created by the shelter's specific configuration. Franklin remained alert throughout the night, monitoring both the shelter's performance and the emergency radio communications. His military training had taught him to evaluate survival situations objectively, without emotional reactions that could lead to poor decision-making during critical moments. The technique was functioning exactly as Captain Morrison had described, creating sustainable conditions even as the storm raged with unprecedented fury outside the protected area. The Peterson Ranch experienced its first major equipment failure around midnight, when the primary generator overheated due to excessive demand from the heating systems. Tom Peterson and his crew worked to restore backup power while attempting to maintain adequate temperature in the livestock buildings. Their radio communications indicated growing concern about their ability to maintain operations if the storm continued beyond the predicted duration. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the Peterson Ranch's backup generator had also failed, leaving the operation without heated facilities for their cattle. Tom Peterson's emergency calls requested assistance from county services, but dispatch confirmed that no rescue teams could respond until weather conditions improved significantly. The ranch's modern infrastructure, designed for normal winter operations, was proving inadequate for the extreme conditions that Franklin's experience had anticipated. Franklin listened to the deteriorating situation at neighboring ranches, while his own shelter continued providing stable protection. The thermal retention technique required no mechanical systems, electrical power, or fuel supplies that could fail during extended emergency conditions. Its effectiveness depended entirely on correct implementation and the natural physics of wind flow and heat retention that remained constant regardless of weather severity. The storm's peak intensity occurred between 3 and 5 o'clock in the morning, with sustained wind speeds exceeding 50 miles per hour and visibility reduced to 0. The temperature reached -2 degrees Fahrenheit, creating wind-chill conditions that would cause frostbite in exposed skin within minutes. Emergency radio communications reported multiple equipment failures at ranch operations throughout the region, with several requesting evacuation assistance for personnel trapped in buildings without heat. Franklin's shelter maintained its thermal envelope throughout the storm's most dangerous phase, demonstrating the technique's reliability under conditions that were disabling modern mechanical systems. The configuration continued protecting him from wind and cold without requiring any fuel, electrical power, or mechanical maintenance. Captain Morrison's training had emphasized that the technique's greatest advantage was its independence from any external systems that could fail during emergency situations. As dawn approached, the storm's intensity gradually began to diminish, though conditions remained dangerous for travel or exposed outdoor activity. The wind decreased to sustained speeds around 35 miles per hour, and the temperature slowly climbed toward 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Emergency radio communications indicated that county rescue teams would begin responding to calls as soon as visibility improved enough to allow safe vehicle operation. Franklin emerged from his shelter shortly after sunrise to assess the storm's aftermath across his property. The snowfall had accumulated to depths exceeding 3 feet in exposed areas, while wind had created drifts approaching 8 feet in some locations. The storm's severity had matched his predictions based on the environmental indicators he had observed during the previous day, confirming the accuracy of the natural forecasting methods he had learned through military training and decades of ranch experience. The Peterson Ranch's situation had deteriorated significantly during the night. Without heated facilities, their cattle had clustered in whatever wind protection they could find. But several animals were showing signs of severe cold stress that required immediate veterinary attention. Tom Peterson's radio calls indicated that the ranch's expensive infrastructure had failed to provide adequate protection during the extreme weather event, leaving both livestock and personnel in potentially life-threatening situations. County rescue teams began reaching isolated ranches around 9 o'clock in the morning, using snowplows and emergency vehicles equipped for severe weather operations. Franklin monitored their radio communications as they worked through a growing list of emergency calls from operations that had experienced equipment failures, power outages, and inadequate shelter during the storm. The rescue teams were equipped with mobile heating units, emergency generators, and medical supplies for treating cold-related injuries. Franklin's cattle had weathered the storm successfully using the natural windbreak and their own clustering instincts, suffering no casualties despite the extreme conditions. His preparation methods, based on understanding animal behavior and providing adequate wind protection, had proven more effective than the high-technology solutions that had failed at neighboring ranches. The contrast between his results and those of operations using modern infrastructure was becoming apparent to the rescue teams as they assessed damage throughout the region. The first rescue team reached Franklin's property around 11 o'clock, expecting to find another emergency situation requiring immediate assistance. The team members, experienced emergency responders familiar with winter rescue operations, were surprised to discover that both Franklin and his livestock had survived the storm without distress or injury. Their assessment of his shelter site revealed sophisticated understanding of survival techniques that exceeded anything they had encountered during previous emergency responses. The rescue team's leader, a deputy sheriff with extensive experience in mountain rescue operations, recognized elements of military survival training in Franklin's shelter configuration. His questions about the technique's origin led to Franklin's first detailed explanation of the thermal retention method and its development by specialized army units during the 1950s. The deputy's interest was professional rather than casual, recognizing the potential value of techniques that had proven effective when modern systems failed. News of Franklin's successful storm survival spread quickly through the emergency response network as rescue teams continued addressing failures at other ranch operations. The contrast between his results and those of modern facilities generated serious interest from county emergency management officials who were evaluating the region's preparedness for extreme weather events. Franklin's demonstration that traditional knowledge could outperform contemporary technology challenged assumptions about progress and innovation in survival techniques. Tom Peterson arrived at Franklin's property shortly after noon, driven by one of the rescue teams after his ranch's situation had been stabilized with emergency heating equipment. His conversation with Franklin was quiet and respectful, acknowledging that his dismissal of the old rancher's knowledge had been premature and potentially dangerous. Peterson's questions about the thermal retention technique were specific and practical, reflecting genuine interest in learning methods that had proven superior to his own technological approaches. Franklin's explanation of the technique was thorough but restrained, focusing on practical implementation rather than theoretical superiority. He demonstrated the site selection criteria, shelter configuration requirements, and timing considerations that determined the method's effectiveness. His teaching approach reflected the same quiet competence that had characterized his survival performance, offering knowledge without judgment about those who had initially dismissed its value. The rescue teams documented Franklin's shelter technique as part of their after-action reports, recognizing its potential importance for future emergency response situations. County emergency management officials requested detailed information about the method's requirements and effectiveness, planning to incorporate traditional survival knowledge into their disaster preparedness programs. Franklin's demonstration had proved that some old techniques remained more reliable than modern alternatives under extreme conditions. The storm's aftermath revealed the full extent of infrastructure failure throughout northern Colorado's ranching community. Multiple operations had experienced equipment breakdowns, power outages, and inadequate shelter that endangered both livestock and personnel. Franklin's successful protection of his animals and himself using techniques developed 30 years earlier highlighted the limitations of depending entirely on mechanical systems during severe weather events. Franklin returned to his daily routine as the rescue teams completed their work in the region, satisfied that his knowledge had proven its worth without requiring dramatic gestures or public vindication. The thermal retention technique had performed exactly as Captain Morrison had promised, providing reliable protection when modern systems failed under extreme stress. The validation was practical rather than emotional, confirming the soundness of knowledge that had been dismissed as outdated folklore. The telephone calls from the retirement home stopped arriving after news of Franklin's storm survival reached the local community. His nephew David drove out from Denver the following weekend, this time bringing questions about the survival techniques rather than pamphlets about assisted living facilities. The conversation between uncle and nephew was quiet and respectful, acknowledging that some forms of wisdom transcended technological advancement. Franklin's reputation in the local ranching community underwent subtle but significant transformation following the storm. His advice about weather prediction and emergency preparation began receiving serious consideration from operators who had previously regarded him as an interesting anachronism. The change was gradual and unspoken, reflected in increased visits from neighbors seeking guidance about winter preparedness and natural forecasting methods. The bank officials modified their assessments of Franklin's ranch operation after reviewing the storm's impact on regional agriculture. His zero-loss performance during extreme weather conditions demonstrated operational resilience that had proven superior to more heavily capitalized operations in the area. The foreclosure discussion ceased as financial analysts recognized the practical value of knowledge that could prevent catastrophic losses during natural disasters. Franklin continued his daily work with the same quiet competence that had characterized his entire career, neither seeking recognition nor avoiding the respect that gradually developed among those who had witnessed his storm survival. The thermal retention technique remained available to anyone willing to learn, though Franklin understood that most people would continue preferring modern solutions until circumstances forced them to consider alternatives. Captain Morrison's training had emphasized that some knowledge would always be dismissed until proven necessary for survival.